Snow White and Rose Red, a retelling from the original story by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time there was a widow who had two daughters, Snow White and Rose Red. Snow White was quiet and gentle. Rose Red was wild as the hills, but they loved each other and their mother, so the little house in the woods was a happy one. One winter's evening, as they all sat round the fire, there was a knock at the door. Rose Red opened it and gave a scream. There stood a great big brown bear, but in a deep rumbly voice the bear said, "Please do not be afraid. All I ask is that you let me sleep by your fire tonight. It is so cold outside." "Of course you may shelter with us," said the mother, and she called the girls to set the soup on the stove and to put another log on the fire. "Would you brush the snow from my fur, please?" asked the bear. Rose Red fetched the big broom and carefully brushed the bear's great shaggy coat. Snow White gave him a great bowl of hot soup, and the bear gulped it down in one. Then he stretched out in front of the fire and was soon fast asleep. In the morning Snow White let him out of the cottage, and he padded off into the forest through the deep snow. But in the evening he returned, and once again Snow White and Red Rose and their mother looked after him. After that the bear came every night all through the winter, and they all grew very fond of him. But when spring came, the bear told them he would not be returning any more. "I have to guard my treasure. Once the snows have melted, all kinds of wicked people try to steal it," he said, and giving them all a hug, he set off through the forest. Just as he passed through the garden gate, his fur caught on a nail. For a fleeting moment Snow White thought she saw a glint of gold, but the bear hurried off and was soon out of sight. A few days later, Rose Red and Snow White were out gathering berries to make jam, and they came alongside a fallen tree. Then they saw a very cross dwarf tugging at his beard, which was trapped by the great tree trunk. "Well, don't stand there like a pair of silly geese. Come and help me," he shrieked. Well, no matter how hard they tugged, Rose Red and Snow White were not strong enough to lift the tree. So Rose Red took her scissors and cut off the end of the dwarf's beard. He was absolutely furious and snatched up a big bag of gold from the tree roots and disappeared without a word of thanks. Some days later the girl's mother said she really fancied a piece of fish for supper, so they went down to the river to see what they could catch. But instead of a fish, there on the bank they found their friend, the cross dwarf again. This time his beard was all caught up in his fishing line. "Don't just stand there gawping," he yelled. "Help me get free." Snow White tried to untangle it, but it was impossible, so she too snipped a piece of his beard off. He was quite white with rage, but just grasped a casket of jewels that lay at the water's edge and turned away without a word of thanks. It was the spring fair a few days later. The girls decided to go and buy some new ribbons for their hats, and their mother wanted needles for her embroidery, so they set off early in the morning. They had not gone far when they heard a terrible shrieking and crying. They ran towards the sound, and there once more was the cross dwarf, this time struggling in the huge talons of an eagle. They tugged, and the eagle had to let go. "You have torn my coat," muttered the ungrateful dwarf, and picked up a basket of pearls and hobbled off as fast as possible. The girls just laughed and continued on their way to the fair. They had a wonderful time, and it was quite late when they walked slowly home. The sun was just sinking behind a big rock when, to their astonishment, they came across the dwarf again. There, spread out on the ground in front of him, was a great pile of gold and precious jewels and pearls. Suddenly the dwarf saw Snow White and Rose Red. Go away! You horrid girls are always in my way," he shouted. But just then there was a huge growl, and the great brown bear stood by their side. With one huge paw he swiped the dwarf up into the sky, and no one ever saw where he fell to, earth again. The bear turned towards Snow White and Rose Red, and as they looked, his great shaggy coat fell away. There stood a handsome young man, dressed in a golden suit of the richest velvet. "Do not be afraid, Snow White and Rose Red," he said, smiling. "Now you can see who I really am. That wicked dwarf put a spell on me so he could steal all my treasure, but you have broken the spell by your kindness." They all went home laden with treasure. They talked long into the night, and it was all still true the next morning. Snow White married the handsome young man, who, by great good fortune, had a younger brother, who married Rose Red. So they all lived happily ever after. But if you ever find a dwarf with half his beard missing, I would be very careful if I were you.